Fishing vessel Grateful and Maritime Coastguard, we are reading you loud and clear.
Well, hello, I'm Julia Gosling and welcome to Sea Views podcast. And today I am welcoming Matt Baer, and he is a retired captain from the US Coast Guard. And now you are Director of Emergency Response at Gallagher Marine Systems. So you actually couldn't wean yourself off maritime crisis management, could you?
No, Julia, that is exactly correct. I feel honored to work with a great company with Gallagher, and I'm very proud of my service in the U.S. Coast Guard, and looking forward to a great conversation.
I've been keen to do something on search and rescue for quite a while, actually, on Sea Views, and just to admit my interest in this area. So I spent 18 years with the UK Coast Guard, the Maritime Coastguard Agency. And so I've worked in the press office there for a long, long time before I finished with them 3 years ago. And so I've seen the UK maritime search and rescue world in detail. And it'll be really interesting to see, how that compares, and we can have a good chat about that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely appreciate your service in the MCA there, and with the UK Coast Guard. Our press offices and the US Coast Guard were very vital, to our success. In particular, the longer the duration of a search and rescue case or what have you, making sure that we told the right story to the public who had a lot of interest in what was going on was definitely key. So I can only imagine, your 18 plus years of service. I can only imagine you helped tell many stories that kept the public and the media and everybody informed.
Yeah, it was some real interesting adventures and lots of great incidents and pretty difficult days as well, as you well know, but really amazing times. So Matt, tell me a little bit about your role now and your interest in sort of maritime and search and rescue, because obviously you got all those years in the Coast Guard.
Yeah, so as the Director of Emergency Response for Gallagher Marine Systems, we are a regulatory compliance, qualified individual, incident management team, spill management team company who offers a wide range of services to our clients who are all around the world, both in the U.S. and foreign flag vessels that call on the U.S. And so ultimately, we respond to whatever the crisis may be. And it could be an oil spill, it could be a fire aboard a vessel, a collision, a lesion, grounding, or what have you. And yes, we even get involved, sometimes in medical evacuations and search and rescue cases. So I had the pleasure and the honor of working with Gallagher on a high-profile event back in 2019 in St. Simon Sound, Georgia, where a roll-on, roll-off, a car carrier capsized, on an outbound transit. I was a commander at the time in the Coast Guard, and we saw the full evolution of an event from the rescue of 24 people on board, including 4 people out of the engine room, where we actually had to work with industry to actually cut holes in the hull, to actually extract the people from the vessel. And so I was in my capacity as a U.S. Coast Guard search and rescue mission coordinator at the time. Gallagher was in the capacity of serving as the qualified individual and incident management team for the vessel. And that's the first time we came together. And so when I retired from the Coast Guard back in 2023, Gallagher reached out and said, "Hey, would you like a second career?" And I said, I'd be absolutely honored to work with you guys. So search and rescue is not necessarily our bread and butter right now, but I mean, when the call comes in at the middle of the night or the middle of the day, we serve to support our clients all around the world in whatever manner that might be.
Excellent. And I mean, that is the first rule, if you like, of any big major incident, be it an oil spill or a collision or a fire or grounding, is first of all, it's prevent loss of life, isn't it? And then that's the priority, isn't it? And obviously it's also pretty high profile when it does happen. And then obviously there's the protection of the ships and the protection of the environment. So, but people first.
Absolutely. I mean, I was taught a long time ago in the Coast Guard that in an incident, it's ultimately, I heard two different acronyms, PEPE or PEEP, and it's people, the environment, property, and then economical impacts. And, when you start looking at that, it goes around the world the same way. I mean, maritime commerce is the lifeblood of the world, and shipping, it's how we transport, people, things, cargo, precious resources such as oil and other things. And we ultimately want to protect people first. We want to protect the environment, that we are entrusted, to sustain. And then it's really about, can we minimize or limit the impacts to property, and can we keep the economy flowing as best as possible?
No shipping, no shopping.
That, exactly, especially this time of year, right?
I'm 95% of the stuff that everyone's queuing up to buy today that I just saw, that's come by ship, certainly to us anyway in the UK.
Yeah, it reminds me, I have a lengthy shopping list left, for Christmas and the holiday here.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I know it comes at the same date every year, but I'm never ready.
You and me both, Julia.
No, the podcast is usually co-hosted with Adam Parnell, and he is director at CHIRP. And CHIRP is the confidential hazardous incident reporting program, and it is international, and they have reports from people all over the world who report on incidents, near misses, any dangerous practices. It's completely confidential, and then they share all of that data so that people can learn lessons and it doesn't happen to them. And Adam can't join me today, which is a shame, because I would have loved to have him here, and he's normally my co-host. But he did say that they actually do receive a number of reports from within the international maritime search and rescue community. So it reaches everywhere. But obviously, again, it's about protecting people while they're working at sea, because they are seafarers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. My search and rescue career probably started, I was thinking about this earlier, probably back in 1997, when I was on a patrol boat in Hawaii, was the very first search and rescue case I was ever involved in. And then in 2001, I really started on the search planning side of things when I learned about the international aspect of how, the international search and rescue plan leads to rescue coordination centers around the world. And then, that bleeds back to, the home country. In the United States, we have Coast Guard districts, around the United States that have RCCs or rescue coordination centers. And yeah, I mean, it can happen at any place, anytime. And, communications are key. I mean, if it happens closer to land, we have a better chance of getting, radio communications about an incident. Thanks to Starlink and satellite communications, we sometimes get calls for vessels that are 1,000 miles from anywhere, and trying to coordinate a rescue with that, with C-130s or other, cargo planes that can go that far offshore and provide something to assist a mariner in distress is definitely a challenge that everybody faces. But I mean, it showcases, the maritime commerce. An incident can happen anywhere. That's
yes, sure. And also that international aspect, because even though, say, in the UK we're an island, but we are completely surrounded by multiple different search and rescue areas of other countries all around, and so there's some complex communications happening when those incidents happen out at sea. And obviously between the UK and the US, some of the North Atlantic incidents can be, a good 1,000 miles offshore. There's a lot of coordination needed to sort of find resources, get some help to people. Those are some of the scary places where things happen, where there's not a lot near you to help you.
Well, yeah. And then as to your point on the North Atlantic, I mean, weather is an issue 12 months out of the year. It can always be bad, whether it's the winter months or a potential tropical impact, that makes its way north. And the collaboration between countries is important. But I also think, there's a kind of a law of the sea that other vessels help other vessels, and if somebody comes across something, they almost have a duty to respond and help. And that's not lost on me either. There's been many times the AMVER process, was utilized, which automated mutual vessel emergency response.
Oh, yes, thank you for spelling that acronym out. That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I actually hope I got it right. I'm pretty sure I did, but vessels sometimes are the that are 1,000 miles offshore are the quickest response. I mean, when you look at the trade routes that most vessels follow, if somebody's going to get into a situation, it's probably on a Great Circle route or a customary route of trade between countries, and chances are another vessel might be in the area that can render assistance. Yes. So it's definitely a coordinated government approach, but it's also, the private entities that exist out there, are really vital to helping out one another.
Yeah, that law of the sea, I think it's really important. And I know I've always been really, really impressed in the past when I've been dealing with incidents. And obviously I know blow by blow what's happening when I'm the press officer. And it's really impressive when some of these big ships, that they stop. Maybe they help with a search for a long, long time that's out at sea, or they will actually go to the aid because they are told they're the nearest vessel. And that is impressive because that's a lot of money. I mean, if you're talking about time is money when you're transporting things, but it's really amazing that, that still happens, and thank goodness it does. And of course, sometimes the actual seamanship is amazing. I don't even know how you go about bringing a little yacht, getting people off a little yacht when you're a 300-meter cargo ship in awful weather. So there's huge sort of efforts sometimes that are made for another mariner, and that's quite heartwarming, actually.
Julie, I can agree with you more. It's definitely impressive what other vessels do to assist one another. And to the seamanship side of things, you're spot on. I mean, it's one thing to navigate a Great Circle route, but it's another thing to navigate and pilot actually in close proximity to another vessel. Chances are pretty good, as I'm sure you've seen in your career. Most vessels don't tend to get in trouble on a bright sunshiny day where the seas are flat, calm. There's always some weather impact to it, and that just increases the risk, increases the potential, danger, that exists, when you're trying to assist another mariner in distress. And, there's plenty of vessels that, transit across the pond between you and I, sailing vessels, smaller vessels. There's even, races that exist where, self-propelled, vessels are making that turn. Crazy. So, yeah, in 1999, I think it was, there was, an around the world alone, race that started in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't remember all the details, but the Coast Guard cutter that I was on at the time, we officially were the starting line for it. Like, it was a big deal. And I just remember looking at those vessels and thinking, wow, they're going to go around the world. I'm sure they were great navigators and had great seamanship skills, but that was to me, I'm like, no, thank you. I'll stay on my Coast Guard cutter with 75 other people in the comfort of a helicopter deck on here. And all
same. But of course, you and I, Matt, we've seen the worst of it, so it ruins a day out at the seaside for me still. It doesn't help because we see the worst instead of all the millions and millions of voyages and days out at the coast that obviously don't end in disaster. So I think you and I are probably a little bit biased towards the negative.
Yeah, no, Julia, you're spot on with that because, I'm, in my role with Gallagher, and the Coast Guard, I was predominantly in search and rescue, law enforcement, counterterrorism side of the Coast Guard for counter drug, for a large portion of my career. And then, in the last, 5 to 7 years, I got more involved in the maritime commerce, marine safety side of things. And, where I'm at in North Carolina, we have the Port of Wilmington and the Port of Morehead City, which are both relatively small ports in the grand scheme of things. It's not the Port of New York, New Jersey, or Los Angeles, Long Beach. But the number of vessel transits that occur safely on every single day is amazing. In North Carolina, we have the second largest state-run ferry system, in the country, and multiple transits a day. Probably 50 transits a day across the state, and they all go on safely. And to your point, unfortunately, you and I in our jobs have seen the 1% time where they don't go safely, and then so much of our focus is on the negative. I think as we were talking before we started the podcast, it's pretty amazing, how much commerce flows around the world. And I think that the IMO regulations and various regulations that have been enacted by various countries are very successful. I mean, the rates of incidents that are occurring now comparative to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's definitely dropped off. But unfortunately, whenever a bad incident occurs, it's still very bad. And there's a high potential for whether it's an oil spill, a shipboard fire. I mean, we're dealing with new novel things now with lithium ion batteries.
Yes. Larger container ships than they ever were.
A lot of container ships. I mean, nurdles, with plastics, that's, are potentially impacting the water. New technologies, to try to go greener with the shipping industries, which obviously we commend because we want to protect the environment. But these new contingencies, we're not just dealing with oil anymore. You're dealing with other forms of propulsion. That I think governments and responders are trying to make sure that we're ready to respond to those contingencies as well.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of change coming with that decarbonization agenda, isn't there? And obviously it's a lot for vessels to, they've got to take on new technology, train people, and some of them have got some high risks with them.
Absolutely, you're not wrong there.
We did do an episode on decarbonization, green fuels, and some of the difficulties that are inherent there. Is quite an interesting topic, isn't it?
Absolutely, and there's a lot of industry, academia, environmentalists, nonprofit organizations, and the shipping agencies and companies like mine who are all really working together. It's very impressive to see how everybody comes together, kind of the whole of government, whole of industry approach, to try to solve the problems. So I think we're moving in the right direction for those novel contingencies. But it definitely, every time you get a phone call, it's always perks your rate up as to what's this one going to bring.
Yeah. Hey, so let's play a game now. We can play trump cards for Coast Guards, okay, between US and UK. So you have over 4 million square miles of sea search and rescue. The UK's still got a pretty big area, like well over 1 million, maybe 1.25 million square miles of a sort of search and rescue zone. For a small island, that's quite a lot to cover. So you definitely beat us on square miles. What in the UK we've got a network of Coast Guard helicopters and lifeboats. What's the network? How does it compare in the US?
Well, so the Coast Guard in the US would probably, we kind of looked at a force laydown of, near shore, mid-shore, offshore, and then, further offshore type of thing. So, there are short-range helicopters, longer-range helicopters, and then really C-130s or C-144, planes that can fly further offshore. And then there's a laydown of boats that may be able to go offshore 50 miles, patrol boats that may go offshore up to maybe 150 to 200 miles. And then longer range cutters that really are transnational. They can really go across the pond, across the Pacific overall. So, that force laydown is looking at not just the square miles of ocean to cover, but, the U.S., I think, has somewhere along the lines of 95,000, miles of coastline. And there's a large recreational boating population, as I know is similar to the UK as well. There's a lot of people who aren't commercial who operate on the water as well. And I would say that those number of search and rescue responses far outnumber the responses that are required to aid professional
Yeah, save in the UK.
Now, on the flip side, when a professional mariner has a problem, it generally is a really big problem, as opposed to maybe a recreational boater in the U.S. Has a breakdown of their motor, or they're drifting towards a jetty or something. Not to say that's not a problem, it is. But I think the U.S. Coast Guard is pretty well postured with rescue boat stations, up and down all the coasts, to include the Great Lakes. Generally a short range helicopter or a rescue boat can get on scene, pretty much anywhere in the U.S. within an hour or so of a notification. Now, sometimes an hour is too late. You need to be there in minutes, and most of our stations in the U.S. are in pretty close proximity to where the recreational boating public has its densest population.
Yeah, so you sort of hotspot where the best place is to be based on sort of incidents. Yeah, so similar thing in the UK as well.
And I think we took a lot of lessons learned from the UK. I mean, when the US was, founded, 250 years ago, and then, the life-saving service was founded in the 1800s, it was, there were Coast Guard. Well, back then, the life-saving stations, were like every 30 to 50 miles, the entire coast. And they were there to complement the lighthouses that were warning the maritime traffic of where to avoid. And, it's grown to whereas the Coast Guard now has far more capable assets, the spacing of the stations has increased, but there's still like a planned overlap of the response time, for how quickly a boat can get on scene. And it's the same force laydown with the helicopter stations as well. Generally speaking, you'll have a helicopter station probably every 300 to 400 miles along the coast, with the idea that those short range helicopters, can get on scene, very rapidly to where the distress is.
Yeah. Okay. That's, there's a similar setup in the UK, but it's interesting because in the UK, our Coast Guard is His Majesty's Coast Guard, is part of government, and they coordinate search and rescue centrally in the UK. We have a network of Coast Guard rescue helicopter bases, but the actual lifeboats are provided and have been for over 200 years by volunteer organizations. But you have a different setup in your Coast Guard in the US is military. So you've got multi-roles as well as search and rescue, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah. So I had the opportunity to support one of our clients over in the UK earlier this year, and it was a vessel situation that occurred in the North Sea. But I got to actually go by one of those the RNLI is what I think you're referring to with the boat stations. It was in Cleethorpes in the UK, over by the River Humber, and I got to see up front and personal like their response posture, and it's very, very impressive. What those volunteers do. In fact, the vessel situation that I was involved in, the RNLI actually was able to help rescue several of the people that were involved in that. Now, in the U.S., like you said, the United States Coast Guard is one of the 6 armed forces of the U.S., but it's the only one that's not part of the Department of Defense or Department of War, as they're calling it now. We're in the Department of Homeland Security, and we're a multi-mission, military, but also marine safety, law enforcement agency. And there's 3 components really to the Coast Guard when you look at the workforce. So there's an active duty military component. There's a reserve component where it's a surge force capacity. And then there's actually volunteers in the Coast Guard as well, called the Coast Guard Auxiliary, who actually provide really great support all around the country. I've forgotten my numbers because I retired 2 years ago, but the population of the U.S. Auxiliary, the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 people, as I recall. And they provide boat support and in some cases aviation support all around the country. So it's a force multiplier that the U.S. Coast Guard cannot do what it does if they didn't have that volunteer component to it.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't actually know that. And that shows me another similarity with the UK, because the search and rescue coordination is all full-time staff in coordination centres, right? But there's, thousands of volunteers out at the coast in each sort of little town or village on the coast. And again, amazing contributions of time to serve as a volunteer, as an auxiliary. And that's interesting. So you have a lot of similarities actually in the US, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the same thing for us, like, search and rescue stands for search and rescue, as we know. And like when you're planning a search, that's a very detailed thing that there's a lot of mathematics involved in it. There's a lot of what are the winds doing? What is the sea doing? What are the currents doing? If you don't find somebody immediately, you're inevitably going to have to deal with the drift of a person in the water, a boat in the water. And, as we know, the sea is dynamic, nothing stays stable. And so there's a search planning aspect to it. And then, there's an actual search aspect to it. And then there's the rescue piece as well. And, obviously when you find your search object, that's when the rescue comes in. And I'm always amazed at, in the US, we have a lot of laws that govern everything that happens on land. But unless something's over 300 gross tons or is carrying passengers for hire, there's very little regulations when it comes to like a very small vessel. I mean, if you have money and you have a boat ramp, you can get on the water, and really it's very free, to get out there. I mean, I've owned several boats in my lifetime, and it's an awesome feeling just to be out on the water, but it also opens yourself up to a lot of inexperience out there, which can lead to vessel collisions, groundings. Bad things can happen on the water because it's very easy to have access to the water. Again, all you need is money and a boat ramp where you can put that boat in the water, and you can be out on the water, very quick.
Yes, Matt, exactly the same problems here in the UK. I mean, it's great that we have the freedom of the sea, as people say, but that you got to respect it as well and be trained and have the right equipment. I mean, the life jacket situation is an interesting one, because obviously, you can send a Coast Guard helicopter to go and pick someone up, but if they're not floating, you're not going to get them back alive. And we've got some different laws in the UK. Fishermen now have to wear a life jacket when they're working on deck, for example. That's the most dangerous profession. So it makes sense. That's relatively new law here, but not recreational boaters, even though it's encouraged. What about in the US? Do you have some like bylaws or local laws that make people wear jackets, life jackets?
So I would say the easiest way to answer, Julia, is there's always a life jacket requirement, to have it on board. When it comes to actually wearing it, the regulations, unless they've changed since I retired 2 years ago and I'm just unaware, a lot of that is left to the states to decide. There was a federal life jacket law that was passed several years ago that basically requires anybody who's 13 or I think it says actually under 13 is required to wear it. Now, some states have gone more stringent than that, but from a federal standpoint, really the only life jacket requirement, other than carrying it on board, the only requirement to wear is really on under 13, aged persons. It's always a debate because, when you have the unfortunate situation, like I know you and I both have had, where, you can't find somebody, or you find somebody who's deceased. Often the number one thing is like life jackets save lives. And if they had a life jacket on, maybe they wouldn't have succumbed. The problem, and I'm sure it's the same in the UK, is people on a hot July day, they don't want to be wearing a life jacket. It feels much better to be out there soaking up the sun. And most people almost think they're a bit immune to having a tragedy occur to them. Nobody goes out on the water expecting to have something bad happen.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So I think that makes people desensitized to what a life jacket could do.
Yeah,
for them.
it's self-responsibility in the recreational sector. It's difficult because, as you say, nobody wants to think it's going to happen to them. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and we grappling with the same things in the UK as well. Now, I'm thinking also about you touched on it earlier about new technology and so on. Is there any new technology or new tech or AI or drones that you see coming into play now that are going to help in search and rescue or just maritime safety?
Well, I think the number one, one that we used to always speak about in the Coast Guard, and I'm sure the Coast Guard is still speaking about it now, are really personal locator beacons. EPIRB is like the worldwide one that everybody kind of understands, electronic position indicating radio beacon, and those are required to be carried on vessels. But when it comes to a personal standpoint, it's relatively cheap. I think the last time I looked, they're around $200 US, to buy one. And we had a case off of North Carolina several years ago when I was still active duty, where had the person not had a personal locator beacon on, I am certain we never would have found them. But because they had it on, it was amazing that it was a really bad case. The person fell overboard while they were fishing. And ultimately, that PLB, as we would call it, helped us locate that person to save their life. I think other technology, AIS, automated, indication systems or information systems where vessels broadcast their position. Some people don't like to feel like they're tracked or being tracked by somebody. But I mean, if somebody has AIS and they can't get off a radio call, that can help take the search out of search and rescue. As far as drones, the U.S. Coast Guard, we're starting to use them more and more towards the ends of my career. Some of them were used more focused in the counter drug missions, where they could be flown off of the large cutters, that operate hundreds of miles offshore to kind of extend their reach. We use them also in pollution cases or oil spill cases to be a cheaper and faster way of getting a good observation of something that's going on in the maritime environment where we know there are plastics or oil in the water. From a search and rescue standpoint, they certainly could be used. I think the Coast Guard probably is moving in that direction, but I think from an aerial standpoint, they're still mainly focused on using helicopters, which have infrared technologies, to help indicate, body heat sources or vessel sources of heat, out there, that can help better detect and find somebody who might be missing on the water.
Yeah, they have some great camera technology, don't they? In addition to the,
absolutely,
obviously the infrared, which is great because it's so difficult. I've been in the helicopters, and when you're looking at this vast expanse of sea and you're looking for it's unimaginable that they can manage to do those hours of looking and then they can still find just a head in the water, which is incredible feat. So people really are very lucky when they, when you're a tiny target in the water.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning of this, like my search and rescue career kind of started in 1996 or 1997 on an 82-foot patrol boat, off of Hawaii, and we were in one of the channels between the islands there, and we were searching for a missing, windsurfer who had been, windsurfing and didn't come back when they said they were going to. And I remember being up all night, and we were in probably 10 to 12 foot sea, so 3 to 4 meters, which is not huge, but it's also not comfortable, when you're on an 82-foot vessel, and with those waves, it makes it even harder to detect something. And all we had at that particular time were our God-given eyes. And, you have a crew of 10 people out there, and, you have 3 or 4 or 5 people who are up searching at the same time and looking. It really is almost an impossible task. You really have to get lucky. You really have to have some level of fortune on your side. But you have to maintain vigilance, with your searching as well. And I'm grateful that there's new technologies that are out there that can, certainly improve the chances of finding somebody at sea. Unfortunately, that very first case, we did not find what we were looking for. Unfortunately, I was not involved in the decision to suspend the search, but the search was suspended. And, somebody had to do that unfortunate next of kin notification to say, hey, look, we couldn't find what we were looking for. And unfortunately, we're not going to continue searching. So those are some of the harder parts of my Coast Guard career as time went on. I think my number is somewhere around 63 or 64 next of kin notifications that I've had to do. And those are, there's no good way. There's no script. There's no, book that you can follow for how to do it, because everybody reacts differently to that news. And that's, it carries a heavy burden, on the person who has to deliver that news as well. It pales in comparison to the family or the friends who are receiving the news. But, the duty that calls you to have to break that news to somebody is heartbreaking as well.
I really did feel for my, Coast Guard operational colleagues that did any of that liaison type work. And it's, in terms of contact with family, really, really, really tough times. You've kind of almost talked about, I was going to ask you about your worst day at work. I think you probably covered that, unless you wanted to tell me about any other days.
Well, Julia, I think my worst day at work was probably in 2021, 2022. I can't remember which year it was, but we had a plane crash that occurred in North Carolina, and on board were 4 adults and four young men who were 14, 15 years old, and my son was about to turn that age, I think. So he was born in 2007. So again, 14, 15, and it was very personal in that regard. And I had to speak not only to families but to a community who was grieving in Eastern North Carolina. And I had to do, press conferences and media outreach. And, it's very hard whenever something hits home with you to kind of wear the uniform and put on the brave face and speak intelligently and speak with positivity when you're trying to do a search, whenever you almost know that the search is futile. It's not going to lead to positive results. So, I could talk more if you wanted me to, but that was probably my worst day, was whenever I could have a personal connection with what we were trying to do. And you just have very, very little hope, yet you're trying to portray hope because people want to know that the U.S. Coast Guard is doing everything they can to bring home their loved ones, their community members. And, being on national news, talking about that, there's, a heightened awareness to the fact that, it's the U.S. Coast Guard brand that's being spoken about too. And that's where professionals like yourself helped me out greatly on making sure that I could stay on the right message, to tell the truth, absolutely. That's always first and foremost, but to actually try to have a positive message whenever, it's a really gloomy situation.
Yeah, it's really tough. It's a really tough situation. And then, we've all had some bad days in search and rescue when you didn't get the outcome you wanted. But do you want to tell me about your best day?
Well, my best day is when, obviously when you think the search is not going as well as it could, and then you find what you're looking for. And I think honestly, the best day that comes to my mind, kind of on the spot, was really that day that the person fell overboard, and we were tracking the case very closely. It was actually during the day. We can almost hear it in real time. And when another vessel called in and said, I found him, it actually wasn't even a Coast Guard rescue. It was a Good Samaritan who was out there, who found a vessel drifting. When they looked over, they expected to see the worst. They expected, oh my gosh, is somebody going to be dead on the deck or unresponsible on the deck? And when they looked over, they couldn't see anybody. And they ended up going into the chart plotter that the vessel had been using on their fishing trip. And the Good Samaritan retraced the steps of that person, of that vessel, and ended up finding the person. And it was such a joyful day, to be able to hear the sheer joy in that person's voice on the radio that they had found that person. And for us, it seemed a vessel drifting. We had no idea how long it had been drifting for until we got more information. It sounded like one of those potential cases that was not going to have a good outcome. And then to have that joy pop up, it was really,
yeah,
really
I
good.
bet everybody in all of the different operations groups, because there's so many people involved in a big search like that, was over the moon. That kind of makes it worth it, all the bad ones. And I remember one with commercial fishing here in the UK, and there was a guy went overboard from a fishing vessel big storm, bad weather, and they sent the helicopter. It's night, of course it's night, it's cold, and they can't get him back on the boat, even though they saw him go over, but it's just too rough. They can't get him back on board, and they get the rescue helicopter there as quickly as they can. But our winchman, he said he'd never pulled out a fisherman alive in 20 years. And then we're all following it to see, what the outcome's going to be, and feeling very gloomy. And he goes down and pulls the fisherman out alive and kicking, wearing his life jacket, which he had put on, and so he wasn't just lucky, the boat owner had said, wear your life jackets. He'd worn his life jacket, and that night he lived to tell the tale. And we were just so overjoyed. And I met him because we gave the crew an award as well, because there was a lot of things that they'd done to get to that point, in terms of doing the right thing. And so I met what we called the unicorn, the one that survived, which was such a good moment.
Yeah, Julia, you bring up, as we talk, we could probably talk for several hours about, the joy and the heartbreak. I can remember several cases where they worked out really well, where somebody swam into the surf and was able to save somebody. And in the Coast Guard, we have an award called the Silver Life Saving Medal. And that generally is provided to people who are not on active duty, who end up, saving a life. And I think in my 3 years, here in North Carolina, as the captain of the port and the sector commander, I think I got to present 3 of those, to people. And one ended up being an active duty U.S. Coast Guard petty officer who, she was at the beach in a non-duty status, and ended up saving several lives, putting herself in harm's way, and swam offshore and out through the surf, and was able to bring people back to shore safely. And those are just joyful times too, when you hear that story of just there's a lot of strife in the world, there's a lot of heartache in the world, and when you hear stories of humans helping humans, it brings a lot of joy, I think. And and going back to my very first, you asked about one of my best days. I go back to my current company with Gallagher, when I spoke about the case in 2019. When we heard about a capsized car carrier with 24 people on board, we had accountability of 21 of those people, and we're able to rescue them. I think 11 of them by boat, and 9 of them by helicopter. Several of them rappelled down the side of the vessel by tying fire hoses together, and then ended up jumping like the last 8 to 10 feet, so whatever that is, 2 to 3 meters, onto a Coast Guard vessel. But we still had 4 people who were unaccounted for. We knew they were in the engine room, but we didn't know their status. And that entire night, we had vessels that were tapping on the hull. We generally knew where the engine room was, but we were trying to tap to see, would we get any tap backs. And when we finally got tap backs and realized that people were alive in there, it was both frightening, because you're wondering what conditions are they surviving in, but it was also very hopeful to go, maybe we can save the other 4. And industry came together. Gallagher Marine Systems did an amazing job coordinating with industry on bringing experts together who could cut into the hull of the vessel. And then we were able to pass water into them, through, a hole about that size, and then was able to cut, and 3 people were there. And there was still 1 person who was in the engine control room, the ECR. And so we ended up having to put people in board there in hazardous conditions to go cut that person out. But when you talk about the best day, when that 4th person came out, it was unbelievable, for the U.S. Coast Guard, of course, but really for industry, who came together to say, hey, look, that's one of ours in there. We're going to help that person. We're going to do everything we can to save their life. And the U.S. Coast Guard could not have done that. We did not have tools to cut into the hull of a ship. We had to rely upon industry to help us. And it just shows that again, when humankind comes together to try to help each other and save lives, it's a beautiful story.
Yeah, that is a hugely complex operation, but what a fantastic outcome. What was the vessel called, that one?
That was the motor vessel Golden Ray. It was a car carrier, that was operating out of the second largest U.S. port for cars, Brunswick, Georgia, which is not a large port per se, but it's a very large car import export port. And so yeah, it was a pretty amazing case. It led to a very large oil spill, and then the largest salvage and wreck removal in the history of the United States. And I got to be part of that with the U.S. Coast Guard for about 5 months, and then, proud to work with the company that, led the response, did a lot of great work, with the community there to, restore the environment, a very, very precious environment with a lot of species, a lot of fisheries, a lot of wildlife, there, and Gallagher with a lot of its, teammates and a lot of other industry, ended up, making the best outcome out of a really bad situation.
Yeah, that's one to be proud of, I think.
Absolutely.
Trying to always end on a positive, Matt. What was there anything you'd like to change in maritime to improve safety? You've got one wish.
One wish. Wow. Boy, Julia, that's a hard one to be put on the spot with, because I just, I think there's a lot of goodness that's going on in the maritime industry right now. Like there really is. Like the incident levels, as I've spoken of, are down quite a bit. When you look 20, 30 years ago, overall. So I think the regulations as they exist, whether they be port state regulations, flag state regulations, international regulations, U.S. regulations, they're doing a really, really good job overall. I think I have a lot less concern on the commercial side of things. I guess, one thing we always talked about when I was active duty in the Coast Guard was, would there be value in having a small vessel licensing system, much like we have a driver's license system, and I think a driver's license system is probably called different things around the world, but I think that's pretty consistent that in order to drive a car, you have to have some level of insurance, some level of a registration saying this is who owns it, and you have to have some level of proficiency exhibited. And when I look at the recreational boats that are zipping all around the U.S. maritime, realm, it's an accident waiting to happen. And so I think that would probably be my one wish. I don't know that, compulsory life jackets, on one hand, I think that would be really, really good. But I think if most boaters were required to have some level of boater education, I think that would probably go a long way. I mean, you see some people who, on channels of marked waterways where large vessels operate, some people don't understand speed, distance, time, and how quickly. And there aren't brakes on vessels, as you and I both know. You can't just hit your brake and stop. And particularly when you have, the large tonnage of vessels that we have, in U.S. waterways and around the world, it definitely, when small recreational vessels get in their way, it's not a good thing. So that's the best I can come up with off the top of my head.
I got you on the spot there, Matt, didn't I?
That's okay. Well, I mean, could I ask you? I mean, what do you see as one wish list? I mean, because I think that as we've talked, I mean, search and rescue is an international concept and a reality, and I'm all for hearing what other people think are great things that would improve safety on the water.
Oh, that's interesting. No guests ever asked me that. Well, I'm going to go back to the EPIRBs, actually, and the beacons, because I think they are absolutely incredible. I've seen that technology in action. I've seen people have their lives saved from it. But I've also seen the other side of it, where the details are not kept up to date. The owner of the beacon hasn't registered the information. So the Coast Guard will get the alert, but they're working blind. And I just feel like there's such an amazing bit of kit and technology, but the responsibility should be on the owner of the beacon just to do your thing. Say, okay, you're going to send a £20 million helicopter operation to me. Least I can do is put the details on so that the Coast Guard will know who are they going out to, who's on board, maybe it's a shore contact that they can speak to, what's on board, what would they be looking for, all of that stuff that you need as a search and rescue person to do your job. And I just think it's a fair trade. And unfortunately, we've got a lot in the UK, a lot of beacons that were registered. You can just get one, but okay, commercially you have to, like it's part of law if you're a proper ship or a vessel. But there's loads of boaters and stuff who don't do it or they don't update it. And so anyway, that's my bugbear, if you like. And I think, come on, play fair. Like if you're going to get that helicopter or those lifeboats coming to you, you do your bit and tell the rescuers what they're coming to.
Well, Julia, I think if people would just listen to you and I, if they listen to this podcast and they take those two examples right there, it would probably go a long way to improving safety on the water. Like in my one example where the personal locator beacon helped us find the person. I think you're spot on. I mean, if you can take the search out of search and rescue, that's really, improving the opportunity to save a life. And, it's as we both know, the longer a search goes on, the likelihood, the probability of success tends to drop because the search area just always expands and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And if a boater could have that ability to say, here's where I'm at, come and get me, it would definitely save a lot of resources, save money, but it would absolutely improve the opportunity to save lives for sure.
Yeah. We could solve a few things, couldn't we, Matt? Maybe we'll have to have episode 2 on this. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really, really grateful, Matt. It's been really interesting chatting about search and rescue and all things related to maritime safety with you and getting that perspective on the USA as well and your operations there. So we're going to have to leave the bridge now. I'll ring the bell and we'll leave the bridge from our Sea Views chat. And thank you so much for joining us.
Fishing vessel Great Falls, Maritime Coastguard, we are reading you out and clear.